Hi, welcome back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and welcome to another one of the 12 Days of Christmas. Yesterday, I talked about my best books of 2024, and today I want to talk about my worst books. When I say worst, I don't mean that these were necessarily poor in quality. What I really mean is that these were the most disappointing books. I have a mix of star ratings here, and these are all books that I completed. None of these are DNFs, and usually if I finish a book, it's going to be at least 2 stars because there was something redemptive enough to make me want to continue, whether I liked the writing style or I liked the idea or I was hoping that it was going to get better. There's a multitude of reasons of why I did actually complete the books that I have here. So there's a mix of 3 stars and 2 stars. Again, these are books that I found to be disappointing, so I had higher expectations than what the execution ended up being. Maybe it's unfair to include some 3 stars in here because there were other 3 stars that maybe I even liked less than the ones I'm including on this list, but they didn't disappoint me as much. I guess maybe my expectations just weren't as high. If you liked any of these books, I am so happy for you. And I don't mean that in a sarcastic way. Different books work for different people, so if you loved any of these books, I hope that you are not offended by my reviews of these books, because there are probably books that I've loved that maybe you hate, and that is totally fine. We're starting with number 12. I'm doing 12 because it's the 12 days of Christmas, so I'm doing 12. We're starting at number 12 and working our way up to number 1. Number 1 is my least favorite, most disappointing book of the year. So starting off at number 12 is The Keeper of the Bees by Gene Stratton Porter. I actually really like Gene Stratton Porter's nature writing, and this did not disappoint in that aspect. We have a man who is a veteran and dealing with some grief and some post-war trauma, and he ends up coming to this place in Southern California, or maybe Northern California. I don't know, in California, and he ends up taking over for this man who's gotten sick, who has a whole bunch of bees in this really beautiful garden. He lives right on the coast, and you're just able to see how nature and flowers and bees and the ocean are all part of the healing process, both physically, mentally, and emotionally for this man. If that was all this book had been, I would have loved it. It would have been so high. The writing was so good, but unfortunately, we had some really strange elements in this book. We have this weird romance that you would almost call insta-love, except that the people don't actually see each other for a long time. There's just this weird deal that struck between them, and then our main character falls in love with this girl who he's only really ever had one real conversation with, and he starts assigning motives to her for things, and he loves her for this and gets mad at her for this, and I'm like, you don't even know her. It was so weird. The situation was just bizarre. I can't tell you about it because that would be spoilery, but it was really strange. Number 11 is How Do You Live, which is a Japanese children's classic that I was very intrigued by. I had heard that it was commonly used in schools, and growing up, it was Miyazaki's favorite book, and he actually came out of retirement to create a movie that was based on this book. Earlier in the year, I read Howl's Moving Castle, and so I was like, oh, okay, another book that inspired a Studio Ghibli film. Great. But it really was not what I was expecting at all. It's not fantastical at all, which is fine. I actually did not expect that element of it. We follow a young boy named Copper, and he's just kind of coming of age, growing, learning things. He's supposed to be 15 years old, but he reads like a 10-year-old. So that part's kind of a strange element, but you follow him as he's going to school and he's learning lessons with friendship and different hardships that are happening in his life, the things that he's observing in other people. His father has died, so his uncle is kind of like a surrogate father to him, and he writes letters to Copper in a notebook about life lessons. How do you live? How will you grow up to be a great person and someone who cares about others and all of that kind of stuff. We alternate what Copper's doing and the lessons he's learning, and then the letter that Copper's uncle writes him. And it just goes back and forth like that. Copper's uncle's letters have some profound thoughts in them that are beautifully expressed, but it felt kind of like out of place to me because Copper's already learning these lessons, and then the uncle writes the letter to him, and then at the end of the book he gives Copper the notebook with all these life lessons in it that Copper's already learned and already had conversations with his uncle about. So I feel like it would have been better served if these had been organic conversations of Copper coming to his uncle when he's struggling with this situation, his uncle giving him advice, and then that would have just felt more interesting. In addition, the letters felt a little bit long-winded at times and kind of over moralizing and preachy. And so it felt like this book was written to teach children these moral and ethical lessons in a way that was fairly heavy-handed. I can see why this was used in a school because there's also lots of things about art and science and history in addition to actually these like moral and ethical things as well. So it's got kind of a well-rounded approach to it, but it really just like was not what I was expecting. And I kind of felt bored with the uncle's portions in particular, and I wanted more of Copper and his friends. Next up, we have The Belton Estate by Anthony Trollope. Oh boy, do I have a rough relationship with Anthony Trollope. He's an author that I feel like I should just love, and I don't love him. Unfortunately, I feel like his humor should work for me. He breaks the fourth wall all the time, which I really love, but I just never feel attached to his characters. I'm never invested in what happens to them. It's true that Trollope is definitely a more plot-heavy author, and that's not a bad thing. But if I don't care about the characters, I'm not going to care what happens to them. And so while so far this has actually been my favorite Trollope that I've read, I still found it to be very forgettable, and I didn't find any of the characters people that I rooted for or was interested in. And yeah, there was also some other issues that I had with it in some of the interactions. So it was more successful than other Trollopes, but still ultimately disappointing, unfortunately. Number 9 is Oblomov. This is a Russian classic that sounded hilarious. It's about this guy who's so lazy he can't bring himself to go out of bed, and every day his friends come by and are trying to convince him to get out of bed. And there were elements of the story that were so funny and so witty, and we've got like backstory on why Oblomov turned out the way he did when we kind of flash back to his childhood. And then we have Oblomov falling in love, and will love change him? And it's kind of a conversation of like, are we who we are, or can we change ourselves? And there's some really interesting conversations to be had from this book. But guys, it was 500 pages long. It ended up feeling really drawn out and bloated and boring, which is a shame because I really loved it at the beginning and thought it was quite funny and entertaining. And I think if this book had been 200 to 300 pages, I would have loved it. Next up, we have a book that had some really interesting ideas, but the execution just was not there. And that is The Book of M by Peng Shepherd. Man, I really liked this book in the beginning. I did a whole vlog where I chose books exclusively based on their covers and then tried chapters of each of them to see which one I actually wanted to read. And this book was the one that won. So I was really excited to read it. And it has a really interesting premise in that this thing is taking over the world, and people's shadows are disappearing. And when their shadows disappear, once that's happened over time, they lose who they are as people. Like they lose their memories and forget things. And then as that happens, they're then able to warp reality because they don't remember what's real and what's not anymore. So it's such an interesting premise. But as the book continued and the scope broadened, things got weirder and weirder and made less and less sense. And there were so many questions that I had at the beginning of the book, and none of them were answered by the end of the book. Instead, we just had more questions ramp up, and then things that happened that I was just like, that doesn't make any sense. And it just ended up falling apart completely by the end. And I was so disappointed because it had such promise, and I really liked Peng Shepherd's writing and I liked where she was going with it, but it just had so much potential. I would try another Peng Shepherd book because this was her debut. Okay, we're bridging the gap between 3 stars and 2 stars with a very shocking entry, and that's Lady Susan by Jane Austen. Can you believe that I rated a Jane Austen 2.5 stars? Like, that seems utterly ridiculous. I think before this point, my lowest rated Jane Austen would have been 4 stars, and it's still a really high 4 stars. But man, Lady Susan just was not it for me. Part of it's a me problem because it's epistolary, and I don't like books written in letters a lot of the time because I just don't feel very attached to the characters. Because when characters are writing letters to each other, they're only writing what they want the other person to know. So they're not really writing their true selves. So I feel like I don't really know them very well. Anyways, I also felt kind of like confused as to what was going on because it's so short. So what's happening and the conniving plots of Lady Susan are all packed within a very short amount of pages. And I think that this should have been longer because we could have spent more time with the characters, understood their motivations, understood who they were as people better. But it just felt like really like all over the place. And then it was over. Like I blinked and it was over. And I was like, I don't care about anything that just happened. I know I'm not alone in my dislike of Lady Susan, but I know a lot of people actually really love it too. So it's just kind of all over the place. This is definitely probably a controversial Austen in terms of how people feel about it. Okay, so all the books that I just mentioned were books that weren't bad books, I don't think, but they just like didn't work for me for various reasons or disappointed me for various reasons. Now, all the books that I've already mentioned were 3 stars except Lady Susan, which is 2.5, but I'm pretty sure I rounded it up to 3 on a lot of different rating places. From here on out, every book that I'm going to talk about is 2 stars and below, and I think that they all had like really substantial issues that I don't feel like it was just a me issue, but we'll see what your thoughts are. Maybe you'll think it is just a me issue. Coming in hot at number 6 is The Inheritance by Louisa May Alcott. Besides just being disappointing for the fact that I thought that it was very derivative and very poorly written, it's also disappointing because I hosted a readathon called Alcott April in 2024, and this was the group read that I chose. And I was so disappointed in myself. This book was written when Louisa May Alcott was only, I think, 16 or 17 years old, and I think that's why it feels the way that it does. Like, all the characters are cardboard cutouts. You can see where she copied and got ideas from other authors that she loved, and so it just didn't feel original at all. None of the characters were compelling. I found it to be utterly and completely lifeless and boring. There are other people who liked it more than me. In terms of my co-hosts and other people joining in. So I think I had like the lowest opinion of this book, but because it was written when she was really young, I can definitely give her grace for that. But she didn't publish it in her lifetime. And it wasn't even discovered until I want to say like the 80s or something when the manuscript was discovered and they decided to publish it. There's a reason that it wasn't published previously because it's just not great. I think it's probably a good book to read if you want to be a Louisa May Alcott completionist and read everything that she's written. But I have a friend that couldn't even finish it, and it's short. It's like 200 pages. I have a friend that couldn't even finish it because she said it just felt like bad Jane Austen fan fiction. And I think that's kind of accurate. Next up, we have a book that was disappointing because of the accolades it received, and that's Elf, Dog, and Owlhead. This is a Newbery honor book, you guys. It was nominated for a Newbery, and I can't figure out why. It's got an interesting fantasy plot of this boy who discovers this dog that belongs to these elves or creatures or something that live under the mountain. And he finds out that there's all these other worlds that exist like side by side with his world, but he can't see them because they're like, there's a barrier in between them. And because he has this dog, he can go through the barrier and see these things. When I tell you nothing about this book made sense, I really mean that like, it was very like, I was like, what? Okay, what are we doing here? Like, this is weird. Like, maybe if a really small child read this, they would be like, this is cool, because they wouldn't have any questions about how any of this worked. But I think that if you have an older child or an adult reading it, they'll be like, what? The pencil illustrations were absolutely beautiful and were the most redeeming quality of this book, but I can't for the life of me figure out why on earth this was nominated for a Newbery. My only thought is that it takes place during the time of COVID because this boy is trying to figure out like how to coordinate the laptop usage with his sisters when they're trying to do schoolwork, and he's lonely and he's missing his friends, and his parents are stressed out because their jobs don't feel very secure. And then he just like goes off in this world. So maybe it's supposed to be escapism during like difficult times of COVID, but like this feels like this could have taken place anytime. Like the COVID setting didn't feel very relevant, but as far as I can tell, that's the only thing that makes it like stand apart in any way as to why it might have been nominated. Number 4 was so disappointing because it's a sequel and I loved the first book. That's Three Men on the Bummel by Jerome K. Jerome. I loved Three Men on a Boat. It wasn't perfect 5 stars, but it was so hilarious. I laughed out loud so many times, genuinely enjoyed the antics of these men and the dog. And then we get to Three Men on the Bummel, and it just did not work for me. I was just bored. I don't know if I laughed out loud even one time. There was a couple of scenes that I thought were kind of funny towards the beginning that I think I smiled at and was like, oh yeah, that's kind of silly. I like that. But it derailed so quickly, and they end up going on this trip to Germany. And so it's more of kind of like a travelogue feel than Three Men on a Boat was. And I was just like really, really bored by all the tangents we went on, and I didn't find any of the antics to be very entertaining, which is unfortunate. Okay, we're in the top 3. Number 3 is Shark Heart by Emily Haybeck. I did a whole huge vlog on this book of like, I read this book so you don't have to. So you can check out that if you want to hear my more in-depth thoughts. But essentially, this is a story about a man who receives a devastating diagnosis that he is slowly transforming into a great white shark. Does that sound ridiculous? Yes, it does. Does it sound weird? Yes, it does. But my friend, Whitney, she got this as like a book of the month book that was supposed to be like one of the favorites of the year. So she was able to get it. We decided we were going to do this like a traveling book club where we passed it from one member of our in-person book club to another. So we each got to write our notes in it. Whitney read it first and she actually ended up liking it. So I'm like, oh, okay. Because we were all prepared to just like mock this book relentlessly because it's such a weird idea, right? But she ended up kind of liking it. So I'm like, oh, well, maybe I'll like it. So I went into it with higher expectations. That's the greater disappointment because I thought that this was just ridiculous. Like one of the worst books I read this year in terms of quality. I see what Emily Haybeck was trying to do here. She's trying to illustrate the long goodbye, but there was so much that could have been better because she's trying to make this literary fiction. She's trying to make it sound artsy, and you can tell that she's trying too hard. Like all I could feel was like trying too hard with the emotions, and it was just really unfortunate because I didn't actually feel any emotions at all. While reading it, I just laughed at it the whole time, and I was not supposed to laugh at it. If the author had gone a sci-fi direction with this or a horror direction with this, it would have been so much better. She could have still communicated what she was trying to communicate, but delved into a world where these things are possible, because we definitely have some body horror moments of like some extreme detail of what it's like for his body to transform into this shark. And I'm like, that felt so out of place when she was trying to make it so literary and so artsy. Like she's kind of like switching up mediums as how she's telling this, of like normal chapters, and then she's got chapters that are written like a play, and then she's got chapters that are normal length, and she's got chapters that are like 2 sentences. And so like I feel like she was trying so hard to make it so literary and fell flat on her face, in my opinion. So it was an interesting idea. And you may think it's not. You may be like, that's too weird of an idea. But sometimes weird books can be really good because they kind of tackle something from an angle that disarms you because it's so strange and so out there. So I feel like she could have done something better with this, but it just didn't pan out. Book number 2 will come as no surprise to anyone who heard me talking about this book this summer, and that's The Tale of Genji. This is a Japanese classic also, but much older than How Do You Live? Like it was written in the 1100s or the 1200s. I can't remember which one. So I was really fascinated to read this book about court life during Heian Japan. I thought that that sounded so interesting. Written by a woman, which was also not normal during this time period. So there's so many elements about it that was so intriguing. I was so excited to jump into this book and co-host a read-along of it. But this book is so long and has really unlikable characters, and it ends up being so repetitive and so boring. And I realized that like the poetry element is why there was the repetition that there was. But if I had to read one more time about someone's pillow floating away because of their tears, I was going to scream. Like it was so overdone, so long, and it tells the tale of this prince growing up he's he's an illegitimate prince growing up in like the courts, and like his family and his love life, and man, like he was such a womanizer. Like he's so beautiful and he has beautiful speech and all the women can't get enough of him, and so he's sleeping with all of them. And it just was like, it was so much and so annoying and like upsetting that he's displayed as this romantic figure who doesn't even need to have consent. And there was a lot about it that was just so infuriating, and then a lot about it that was so boring. There were elements to this book that I actually did like, which is why I gave it 2 stars. I felt like its cultural and historical relevance was really interesting. I loved hearing about the different religious beliefs that they had at the time and their different religious customs and festivals and things that they were doing, the way that the politics worked. All of that was super fascinating. But by the time this book was over, I found myself wishing that instead I had just read a nonfiction based on the historical time period rather than reading this giant 1,200-page book about this guy who I really didn't like. But that's not even my least favorite of the year. Are you ready for my rantiest review? I don't know if this is recency bias in terms of how much I hated this book because I just read it in December, but that book is Mr. Dickens and His Carol by Samantha Silva. This is a historical fiction about Charles Dickens as he wrote A Christmas Carol. And almost none of it is historically accurate. The only thing that's accurate is that Charles Dickens was writing Martin Chuzzlewit at the time. It wasn't doing very well, and his publishers wanted him to write a Christmas story. And that's all. That's the only thing about it that is historically accurate. And that really bothers me. We've got an author who is trying to make this story to make Dickens have his own Ebenezer Scrooge transformation, and that's his inspiration for A Christmas Carol. And as such, she attributes attitudes and behaviors to Dickens that he did not have. And it's so frustrating to me because Charles Dickens was an actual living, breathing human being. And I really don't like it when people make up a whole bunch of stuff about someone who was a real human. If you're going to write a historical fiction and play loose and fast with facts and stuff like that at the time, do it with someone who wasn't a real human. Like if you have a historical fiction and the main character is a fictional character and you're messing with all kinds of stuff, that's fine. But if you're taking a real human being who was an advocate of like social injustices and cared so much for the poor, cared so much for the orphaned, cared so much for that kind of stuff, and then you have him mistreating street urchins and then like realizing he shouldn't have done that at the end of the book. I'm like, what the actual heck? Like The Christmas Carol was published after Oliver Twist, after these books where it showed how much he really cared about the marginalized in society because he grew up that way. He grew up marginalized. And instead you have him like all these things attributed to him that didn't actually happen. And she's got all these creative ways. I saw people say it was creative. The ways that like Dickens figured out how he was going to name the people in A Christmas Carol. And really it's just like, oh, he went to a toy store and there was a guy there with a last name Fezziwig. And he's like, that's a great name. There was a guy that he met he didn't like named Jacob Marley. And he's like, he's going to die. At the beginning of this book, it's going to start with him dead. And it's like, okay, that's not creative. It's literally just him like seeing a person and being like, oh, that's a cool name. Or, oh, I don't like that person. I'm just going to use the name like this. And it was just kind of like, it was so weird. There was also a whole storyline about like infidelity that didn't actually make it all the way to like full infidelity, but definitely like some not great intentions that were happening there. There is a lot of conjecture about Dickens and his fidelity to his wife and all that kind of stuff, but there's not historical proof for the things that they were trying to claim in this book, which is just like a whole nother issue. But the author at the end is actually literally like, I'm so sorry to historians and people who love Charles Dickens because I just took complete creative license with this story and didn't care about the facts at all. Like she literally says that in the author's note, and that was so frustrating to me. So anyways, those are my most disappointing books of 2024. If you loved these books, I'm very sorry for my scathing reviews, and I hope that they weren't too upsetting for you. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. Have you read any of these books? So, what were your thoughts? And also, I would love to hear, what are some books that have disappointed you this year? Maybe they disappointed you because they were boring. Maybe they disappointed you because they were like really hyped and they just didn't live up to that hype for you. Or maybe they were just plain bad books. But I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me. And I will see you again tomorrow for another one of the 12 Days of Christmas.